Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second ACDC Presents LinkedIn Live broadcast. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Chris Sutherland, who is the Design Director at StudioFractal. He will be joining us to talk about the award-winning Royal Opera House project. Before we get started, I'll just give a very brief introduction to who we are at ACDC. So we are global architectural outdoor lighting manufacturers. We've worked on some really amazing projects around the world throughout our time, and that's in the fields of stadiums, hotels, retail, public spaces. Quite a few of these projects we have been able to work alongside StudioFractal, for example, on London Wall Place, King's Cross Station in London, and also the Royal Opera House. So I'm delighted to speak to Chris today. So Chris, if you'd like to give us an introduction to yourself and also StudioFractal, and then I'll start asking you some questions.
Right, thank you, Jessica. I'm Chris Sutherland, StudioFractal Design Director. StudioFractal is an independent lighting design company that's been going just over 10 years. We're a smallish team based on the outskirts of London, just off the M25, but we work on projects all around the world. A lot of our stuff is UK based, London based, but we do stuff in the Middle East, we do stuff in different parts of Europe and right across to Canada and the States.
Excellent. So I'm going to dive right in to start asking you about the Royal Opera House. Obviously, it's an iconic building itself, but how did the project come about, and how did you feel when you first got wind that it's a project you'd be working on?
So I felt very excited. I personally come from a theatre background, and I trained doing theatre design and lighting, specialising in lighting design and sound design. And I worked for a few years at the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds. So for me, it was an opportunity to be able to work on the other side of the theatre going experience, if you like, from a lighting point of view. So having done those years of stage lighting, it gave me the opportunity to not only work with how people experience the space, the lobby spaces that we did, as well as the auditorium and some of the bars and restaurants that we'll talk through. So it was, from my point of view, it was great to be able to have that involvement. We came about the project in a fairly normal way for us, in that we were recommended by the architects to the project management team, client team, and we then went through a series of interviews to be able to get the project, and we then started a couple of months later than that. Once we got everything in place and contracts and all that kind of stuff sorted to be able to start the job. We've worked, so Stanton Williams were the architects on the project, and we've worked with those guys before on King's Cross Square, which you mentioned, as well as various other projects. So we had a fairly good relationship with them and fairly good understanding of the way that they approach their work. And we're similar, I guess, with them in that approach, in that early works kind of a concept approach of making sure that we put light where light needs to be, but also we use light to enhance the architectural form of the space. And with this particular project, we've opened up the kind of client directive was not only opening up the building, which the architects come up with this fabulous idea of carving and cutting into the concrete structure beneath the original Bow Street. So they're physically opening it up and letting a lot of daylight through into that space. But it was also about people and opening it up for people to come in and use the Opera House in a different way to what they had done before. So open up was both senses of the word. They wanted people to come in and use these cafe spaces, experience the retail in a different way, and encourage people to go up onto level 5, which is a restaurant space, a winter garden that overlooks Covent Garden. Okay. So there was both sides to it. From a lighting perspective, the idea of this carving in and cutting away underneath the floral hall, or what is the Paul Hamlin Hall now, meant that you got this whole flood of daylight coming into the space, which by day in particular, we needed to balance that space and make sure that we we introduced lighting where we could onto some of the other walls and surfaces throughout. So that was the kind of the initial starting approach. Was okay, we've got all this daylight coming in from one side. How do we balance the space on the other side, and which surfaces and where can we introduce lighting onto those surfaces? And then working with the architects, what were those surfaces going to be? We spent quite a lot of time testing different material, different timbers. Stanton Williams came up with this what's quite a rich timber, this American oak, which they use throughout the space and right into the Limbury Theatre itself. But it took light really well. It kind of came to life. It really brought the warmth out of that timber. And
were you able to actually get in and do mock-ups? Obviously, it's a popular building. I don't imagine they could close for a period of time. How did you manage to get in and do any mock-ups, if you did any?
So the building was closed for a period of time, but it was largely kept open throughout, and they were obviously having performances in the main hall, because this side of the dwelling, if you like, off Covent Garden could be isolated in that way. So we did later on. We did do mock-ups on site, particularly the Limbury Theatre, where we had some lighting within the balustrade front. But we did mock-ups throughout. We did mock-ups with Stanton Williams. We've got some photographs of us playing with light fittings down at their offices. We created a couple of large-scale mock-ups of the big coffers that were in the main lobby in our office. And it was only really when you get to do that you understand the physical scale of these things, and how many coves and coffers we wanted to introduce into the space, and how much light, therefore, we were going to get out of them. So we spent quite a long time battling with that kind of stuff, because the ceiling surface in that lobby space was a big thing. It's a big feature to be able to balance some of that daylight, but also at night to be able to have its own atmosphere. So to be able to introducing those kind of large scale coffers and having them contribute to the majority of the lighting in that space became quite an important aspect of the project.
You mentioned that there were some battles there. What would you say was one of the biggest challenges that you had to overcome? Obviously, the Royal Opera House is a Grade 1 listed building. So what for you was the biggest obstacle to overcome?
There's a few obstacles to overcome. There were spaces. So there's obviously things like Grade 1 listed, and the way in which you can put lighting onto the buildings is limited. But actually, for us architecturally, we wanted to put a small amount of light onto those facades that goes quite a long way. Integrating those into the building where we can, particularly on the new facades where we could do that. On some of the historic facades, it was finding the ledges and the niches to be able to introduce lighting equipment, and then sensitively being able to run cabling around. Position remote drivers became very tricky, and deciding where they should go. But there was always trying to keep, there was always datum points that we were able to use throughout the building, and always trying to keep a logic as to where cabling was going, so we could minimize as much as possible. We couldn't penetrate the building regularly either, so we had to be quite careful as to where cables came out and about. But even inside, there was spaces like in this lobby that you're looking at here, where we had congested ceilings. So we had to work hard in certain areas where we couldn't get lighting into. There was a space actually downstairs in the female toilets, which is an old archways, and it was really low ceiling height. At certain points, it was kind of 2.4 meters, 2.3 meters. But because of the arches and because of the vaulted ceiling, we weren't able to put any lighting up onto the soffit at all. So we'd spent a lot of time working out how we could integrate all of our lighting into the vanity unit, so that we could both uplight into the vault, so that we have a positive space and a negative space as to where we had shadow and light to be able to gain interest and pockets of activity along there. Then put the rest of the lighting into the vanity unit, into the mirrors, into the surfaces. And even then, we were looking to try and put a real kind of richness, and created a kind of bronze bezel that sat around a lot of the lights that were sat in the timber. So there was quite a few restrictions throughout the whole project.
And I'm sure from the outset, the clients, the Royal Opera House, had a certain vision in mind. And when there were these obstacles to overcome, what was that like? How did you work with them to get them to understand certain changes that might needed to happen, maybe even at the
Yeah,
last minute?
the client team were great. Yeah, on this project, it was one of the few projects that I've worked on that were really good fun.
Okay.
That doesn't make it sound like all the projects are bad, but actually the client team were always always open. They were always listening, but they worked hard to make sure you came and worked in an environment that was nice. And actually, I think from my training in theatre, I think that goes through. People are quite practical as to how they want to do these spaces and bring a real enjoyment to doing the job and to creating these environments for people to come to. Because essentially, you're creating a space where people are coming to spend their time and their evening, and lighting in these spaces was the first port of call where we had to add a bit of magic, a bit of atmosphere and mood to the space itself. So the client team, were all on board with all of that quite early on, and I think because of Stanton Williams as well, were on board with that, and they kind of led a lot of that vision with the client team. It really helped for it to be a collaborative, but all of us are going in the kind of same direction as a project.
In terms of products, you talked when you were talking about lighting in the ladies' toilets. Obviously, there's all sorts of luminaires that you would have needed to have used, whether it's those that can be integrated or mountable. What is that process like for you as a lighting designer? How do you make those choices, and really in terms of picking the luminaires that you're going to use?
So, depends on the space. It always depends on the space you're lighting. It always depends on the restrictions, if you like, you've got in there. Often we try and take the approach of see the lit effect, don't see the light fitting, which is easy to say. It's not very easy to achieve, but you've got to work quite hard with the architects to make sure that if you want to take that approach, that you can get enough light across the spaces, so you can integrate into the coffers where we had some tunable white lighting, or whether we were integrating lighting into wall recesses. Even things like the selection of products comes down to what type of ceiling. So when we used a downlight, which we used as few as we could get away with, it had to either do a couple of jobs, wall washing as well as producing functional lighting, if that's what it was doing. But the material finish of it was important to us. The ceiling in a lot of the spaces was acoustic, so they had that sound aspect to it. So therefore, we wanted the inside of the downlight to pick up that kind of textured feel. So it felt as if it didn't feel like it was just put onto that ceiling or into that ceiling. It felt a little bit more like it was carved into the ceiling, and it sat a little bit more comfortably in that space. And we went through a process of testing different ones in ceiling tiles in our studio to be able to do that. Same with images like on the screen here, where quite intuitively we came to the decision that the lines of light in this kind of timber soffit would be a good solution. We still tested it. We still had to come up with a custom arrangement with that supplier that made the light fitting exactly the same width as the timber, so that proportionally everything kind of met together and was measured. And in that particular case, it went along and dropped down into a little pendant that's above the bar that's got a little sparkle point of light at the end of it, and actually a little recessed wall wash in the top of it that kind of helps us put light onto those wall surfaces. So again, going back to that whole point of balancing some of the daylights with it, we were always looking where we could to get light fittings to do as many jobs as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Name one of the things that you personally learned, what you took away from having worked on the Royal Opera House project.
Wow, I mean, there's so many things that you learn on every job. I think one of the key things that I learned was that we spent a lot of time in the floor handling hall, the floor hall as it was, trying to put as little amount of light in there because of the quantity of reflections we were going to get in the glazing, and it's about where we positioned light and then how we aimed it when we came to focus it. We spent a lot of time focusing on this job to make sure that everything was as precise as it could be, and always working with glazing is an important aspect of that learning curve, to make sure you don't see all the light fittings, making sure we only hit the solid surfaces where we could. What the other thing I did learn, and it goes back to electrical kind of engineering background, is getting those guys on board quite early made a massive difference to how we were able to achieve the finished look of the job. And it goes right back to when we were focusing the lights in those downstairs toilets. When Hitton and I actually turned up on site, you could see the electricians were skeptical of how our input was going to help at that point. But just by simply repositioning some lights, they very quickly understood what we were going to do, and bringing them on board with us helped us achieve the effects that we were able to do throughout the job. So that, I mean, that's a massive part, I think, of all jobs now that you've got to do. You've got to get those guys buying into what you're doing. As much as you have the client team, as much as you have the architects, it's about who's putting it in, who's installing it to be able to do that.
Yeah. With it being grade 1 listed as well, just out of curiosity, was there involvement from the likes of Historic England or English Heritage?
Yeah, there was, and conservation officers in the local authority, and we had to submit drawings and images that would comply with that. You know, again, going back to things like penetrations onto the buildings, the minimal amount of those that we can make. Doing the drawings that showed where possible, like in this image here, we were hiding light fittings onto ledges or existing positions above the retail units, so that we could wash all of our light from one side, if you like, around the vaulted archway of the ceiling. It's quite an interesting one. From outside, that became a big factor, and then inside, you've always got that historical nature of what the opera house is. But on this job, we were always balancing new technologies, whether that's tunable white lighting, which was relatively new, and we were looking back at this. We've got big LED screens at the entrance that will help to encourage people to go into the space. We've then got video projection in the space, which was part information, if you like, and part advertising for the Opera House project itself. And then we had to balance, when we were commissioning, we had to make sure that all of those things complemented each other and stood out. We came up with a series of scene setting where we did kind of morning, afternoon, late afternoon, and evening settings, all of which were slightly different, slightly getting more warmer in the evening in terms of the tunable light and reduction of light, so we could get that theatre going atmosphere into the space, and encouraging people to spend time in the restaurants that we've done at the level 5 and going out onto the Winter Garden. There was always elements like that we had to consider.
Yeah. Talking about not just the external spaces, internal as well. But I mean, it's been installed for quite a little bit of time now. Do you know whether there has been a positive impact because of this lighting design, perhaps in terms of increased dwell time in that area, maybe even increased spend? Are you aware of any impacts?
I'm not aware in terms of that sense of increased spend or any kind of things, but without a doubt, not just the lighting, but the whole project, I think, has, when it was open, because of course it's been closed during COVID times, but when it was open, has encouraged a huge amount of people into the space. Even things like the design that we did with Stanton's in the Limbury Theatre. The Limbury Theatre previously was much more of a studio theatre. And it was kind of a black box, if you like, more experimental in that sense. And now it's being changed to be a baby brother main house, if you like. It's complementary to the main house. It's got a real atmosphere in there as a proper space, and that has definitely increased, the kind of ticket sales aspects within that space from the conversations with the people I've had at the Opera House.
Okay. Just this is more of a general question, really, but why add architectural illumination to a building? What are your thoughts as to why, if just say, for example, there was a lovely building somewhere completely unlit, what would your advice be as to why it's a good idea to add architectural illumination to a building?
Well, I think there's twofold there. There's assessing as to what it needs and how to do it, and then the architectural lighting playing a role by night or by day, I guess, but predominantly by night, to be able to bring that to life, to show it off for the best that it can be, but also sometimes for a practical sense. You want to introduce some of that lighting into the space. But architectural lighting is increasing more and more onto buildings, because it not only helps the presence of the building, and therefore something like the Opera House, the presence that it gets within the space, but it also, you know, it encourages the perception of how much light is in a space. Yeah. So all buildings, you know, we see as we walk around looking straight forward, none of us look down at the ground as to how much light's on the floor. So therefore, what that building is doing is contributing to the overall environment. So, you know, it's definitely got a role to play, particularly more and more in the cities. You know, I think there's some projects when you get more ecological about it as to low-level lighting rather than necessarily facade lighting. And some of the resorts we work on are more along those lines.
So then going back, this is actually one of the last questions I had that I wanted to ask you, but in the Royal Opera House project, were your goals achieved? Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, I think we really brought some nighttime atmosphere, nighttime life into places like the Paul Hamlin Hall, into the restaurant level in particular. But yeah, one of my favourite spaces is the Limbury Theatre. Being able to work on an auditorium, partly because of my history, but also just the warmth and the kind of setting that you get, and that anticipation of walking into an auditorium or into a stadium that is set early by the way that the atmosphere of the house lighting, as it is, the auditorium lighting is. So without a doubt, yeah, for me, it ticked all the boxes.
Yeah, and just in terms of, this is quite a controversial question when I asked it last week, I think, but what is one of your favourite projects been that you've ever worked on?
Yeah, so obviously the Opera House was a great project. Kingswell Square was a great project. My actual favourite project has been a private house, townhouse in the middle of London, where we did a small Japanese garden a few years ago, and I learned quite a lot about Japanese culture and Japanese theory, and how you were to light different elements of it. And in this Japanese garden, they have the turtles and the cranes, which are referred to as different types of stones, and some bridges in it. And you know, the fact that you're not meant to light under bridges, and they flew in Japanese moss as part of this development. So it was like an all-round kind of fun area to work to illuminate and to work in. But it had a pure stage set feel to it. So you could light the different elements purely to be viewed from different angles. Nobody was going into this space to interact with it.
Did you have free reign on that, or were the residents, the owner, hands-on?
No, they weren't hands-on. The Japanese designer, they had their own thoughts, and actually some quite strong thoughts in terms of what you should light, i.e. you should never light underneath a Japanese bridge in a Japanese garden. It was news to us at the time. But they're important aspects to their culture, and that, I think that's what made it so fascinating. It was a small space, but it was really kind of interestingly done, and trying to conceal light fittings to be able to achieve that within what essentially was about a 12 metre by 4 metre garden.
My very last question before I open it up for comments from the viewers is, if there's one project in the entire world that you could work on, could be absolutely anything, what would it be?
Wow. I'd quite like to get my house lighting nice. I'd quite like to spend some time actually doing my own lighting at some point. I don't know. We work on such a large, varied kind of scale of projects at StudioFractal that I get the opportunity to work on quite a lot of projects that you wouldn't in normal life. You know, whether they're public realm or whether they're leisure buildings like this, or private resident buildings. We're doing a townhouse again at the moment, an old Georgian townhouse, which is really fascinating, and really going back and looking at specifying old equipment or retro old equipment in that way I find it really fascinating to be able to do that. So, I wouldn't say there's one building or one place that I want to do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So now I'm just going to ask everyone if they have any questions. Can they type them in the comments below, and I'll be able to see them and read them out for Chris. One of them that's come in already is, has the Royal Opera House provided any feedback on if the lighting has met the objectives in terms of visits up to the level 5 or level 4 that you mentioned?
I'm not aware of any, but again, I know as part of the design, part of the big architectural move was to open that up to encourage people to come to flow up that staircase where we had the lighting set into the stairs itself and then go up the escalators. And from my own experience of having been in the space, it definitely seems to be busier with general public up there now than it was when we first started on the project and the old restaurant was in that space.
Okay. Just waiting for some more comments to come in. One of the things I was just wondering about as well, was the lighting project that you did for the Royal Opera House, did this extend to the whole of the Royal Opera House? Obviously it incorporated all the different areas, the lobby, the external parts of the building, the restaurants. Or was it the entire Royal Opera House?
The original appointment was for the Open Up project, which excluded the external lighting that we're seeing here. That was actually instigated as part of a wider works into Covent Garden by a different client team, Capco as it was, where other lighting designers were also working. And then we started working on the facades element. The Paul Hamlin Hall was actually the last element of the whole job that the client kind of agreed with us that it could do with being brought up to speed as it's one of the spaces that was being opened up for people to be able to go into. So actually that was an additional kind of element to the original appointment. And thank God it was. I think that, we've done some work there. We've shown there where actually a very small amount of light and actually a very small budget can go quite a long way. Yeah.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah, a little bit of light can transform a space entirely. So yeah, great. Looks like there's not any more comments for the moment. So I'm going to finish our little interview here. Thank you very much for answering all of those questions. Oh no, we have got a question. Have you got time for another one? In certain areas, colour has been used. Did the Royal Opera House take to this concept, and why was it chosen for these areas? So in that picture on screen at the minute, there is some blue light there.
So yeah, that's actually, so the majority of the time that colonnade is actually lit with warm white light in continuity to the rest of the scheme, and actually quite a lot of the scheme on the inside. But at 10 o'clock at night, it switches to be this blue colour. And obviously they have the flexibility to make it red, blue and pink and whatever else they wanted at different points, although I don't think this particular client team will do that. But the choice of the rest of the colour was, we had tunable white in a lot of spaces. We had 3000 Kelvin as majority of the light sources throughout. But it all came down to what was the surface we were lighting. Was that the timber or was that a different material to be able to bring it to life? With certain downlights, we deliberately chose to have gold kind of tinted on the inside of the bezel so that we got that kind of sparkle effect as well at the same time.
Okay, great. So that's the end of it now. If you can see there, StudioFractal's website is currently flashing across the bottom of the screen. So if anyone watching does have any more questions, you can contact StudioFractal using the contact details on their website. Very grateful for you joining us today, Chris. We do have another LinkedIn Live session coming up on the 5th of November at the same time, and that's going to be an exclusive acdc product launch. So thank you very much for joining us today, Chris. It was really interesting to talk to you about the Royal Opera House.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.